Hello, everyone. Happy Wednesday. As you're joining, we'll give some time to you for you to all sign on. As you're joining, just want to ask you to find the chat button at the bottom of the screen. Go ahead and put what your role is, where you're joining from, your school district. As we begin these webinars, we really want to know who's in the audience. So I'll give everyone a few minutes to log in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. So thank you so much. Welcome to this webinar. It's great to see that you're joining. I see some of our friends from Hannah McMillan, Ohio. I love seeing just the action, the way that districts in the Northeast are responding to the call to action, more importantly than anything. So I'll go ahead and officially welcome you. We'll get started. My name is Megan Maubert, and I am just so honored to be here today to kick off such a wonderful event. Just a couple housekeeping things. Today's webinar will be recorded. This recording link will also be sent to you to share with anyone you may think may benefit from this, or any colleagues you have that you are just super excited to spread the good news with. If you want to turn on closed captions, you can click on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. And also, if you have any questions today, please go ahead and utilize the Q&A button in the bottom tray to post those. We'll definitely try and get those answered throughout the webinar. And then at the end of the webinar, we'll turn some questions over to our very special guest to answer as well. So we do welcome comments in the chat. And I love seeing, thank you to those of you who have put where you're joining us from. But just again, I want to start off by thanking you all and for your commitment to continuing to build capacity about the growing body of science of reading research. As I mentioned earlier, my name is Megan Maubert, and I am a former K-5 elementary teacher. And I know for me personally, word recognition or how to teach foundational skills was something that came first for me when learning about the science of reading. And it seemed just a lot easier for me to unpack. But language comprehension is equally as important, as we know. And I would venture to say that for the majority of educators, including myself that I work with, it's a little more complex to unpack. And, I'm always thinking like, what's the why behind needing to build background knowledge and vocabulary? And how will this, building capacity or building knowledge really build capacity for writing? And so thankfully, we have our wonderful guest, Natalie Wexler, joining us today, who just unpacks this research for us so well and makes it so relatable. So for those of you who aren't as familiar with Natalie Wexler is an education writer and the author of The Knowledge Gap, The Hidden Cause of America's Broken Education System and How to Fix It. If you haven't read it, I highly encourage you to share it with all of your colleagues as well. But she's also the co-author with Judith C. Hochman of The Writing Revolution. And this is just a guide to advancing thinking through writing in all subjects and grades. She's a senior contributor at Forbes.com and has spoken and written widely on issues relating to literacy, cognitive science, and fairness. Her articles and essays have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, the American Scholar, and other publications, as well as on her free Substack newsletter called Minding the Gap. And she currently resides in Washington, D.C. Natalie, are you joining us from Washington, D.C. today?
Yes, I am.
Well, hopefully it's starting to warm up there. I know I am ready for summer as a South Louisiana girl, but you Northeast folks may be ready too. But I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, and thank you again.
Thank you, Megan. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started because I have a lot of slides to get through, and I do want to make sure I leave some time for questions. So without further ado, so comprehension and writing, where do they fit into the science of reading? As Megan said, There's been a lot of awareness lately of the science of reading, including in the mainstream media as well as education outlets. So cover story in Time magazine, and then lots of pieces in the New York Times, including some front page stories. The Washington Post, just my hometown, DC, just ran an editorial on this subject. And a lot of this coverage has been sparked by the really terrific series of audio documentaries done by Emily Hanford and APM. And if you haven't listened to those, I really highly recommend them. And there's one word that keeps coming up in this coverage: phonics. And you might think from reading some of this coverage that that's what the science of reading is all about. Now, systematic phonics instruction is, of course, crucial, not just phonics, but also phonemic awareness, being able to hear the sounds in words and manipulate them, and then being able to connect those sounds to words. But comprehension, of course, is also important. So it's not that science of reading advocates and infographics don't mention comprehension. They do. It's not that they're reducing reading to phonics. So you may have seen these science of reading infographics recently. The simple view of reading, there's language comprehension is right there. And the 5 pillars of early literacy, which is often sort of defined, that's taken to define the science of reading, and comprehension is right there. But of course, infographics are simple. That's their virtue. And they don't tell us much about what goes into language comprehension. There is a more fleshed out infographic that you may be familiar with, the reading rope, Scarborough's rope, which again does mention language comprehension. And even this more fleshed out infographic, it could lead you to think that what we're currently doing with regard to teaching comprehension fits with the science of reading broadly defined. So that's the question that I'm posing. Does the science of reading tell us we just need more phonics? Or are there other aspects of literacy instruction that need to change to come into line with what science tells us about how literacy works? So first, let's talk about the standard approach to teaching reading comprehension, really 2 parts. There's the first part, comprehension is conceived of as a set of strategies and skills, and there's often a skill of the week. And so the teacher will model or demonstrate that skill using a text chosen not for what it's about, but for how well it lends itself to demonstrating, finding the main idea or comparing and contrasting or whatever. And then the other part of this approach is having children, students practice the skill on a book or text that has been determined to be at their individual reading level, which could be well below their grade level, but they will be directed to a basket of books that corresponds to their reading level. And the books in those baskets, again, they're not organized by topic. They're really classified by things like word length, sentence length. And the theory behind this approach is that if kids practice these skills, these comprehension skills, and get really good at them, that they'll be able to use those skills to, find the main idea of any text that they encounter, whether it's a passage on an end of the year reading test or a textbook down the road in high school. If you're good at finding the main idea, you'll be able to find the main idea. So let's just quickly test out that theory. I'm just going to show you a paragraph taken from a newspaper, and I'm sure you're all expert readers, so you should not have any trouble finding the main idea. So here goes. I'll give you a minute to read through that. I don't know, maybe you need a little more time. Okay, so what I didn't tell you about this paragraph is that it was taken from a British newspaper, and it's describing a cricket match. And if you're a cricket fan, you probably have no trouble understanding what this paragraph is trying to tell you. But if, like me, you really don't know anything about cricket, you don't know what this paragraph is talking about. And this is something that cognitive scientists who study reading comprehension have known about for a long time now. So back in the late 1980s, a couple of researchers wanted to know what's more important in reading comprehension. Is it general reading comprehension skills, like finding the main idea, or is it how much the reader knows about the topic? And they chose the topic of baseball. This has come to be known as the baseball study, because they figured they were doing this with 7th and 8th graders, and they figured, there are a lot of kids out there who are not generally good readers, but they do know a lot about baseball. So they took a bunch of these kids and they divided them into different groups, depending on how well they had scored on a standardized reading comprehension test and how much they knew about baseball. And then they gave all of these kids a passage to read describing a baseball game and tested their comprehension of that passage. And here's what they found. What really made the difference in comprehension was knowledge of baseball. So this green bar, those are the kids who scored low on the standardized reading comprehension test, but were baseball experts. And this significantly smaller blue bar, those are the good readers according to the test who did not know much about baseball. So when the poor readers were reading about a topic they knew, they did quite well. And this is not just one study. This same kind of study has been done in numerous other contexts, and the same result has always been found, that knowledge of the topic is more important than general skill. So what these studies tell us, a couple of things. One is comprehension skills. They're not skills like riding a bike or decoding. It's not just a matter of practicing and you'll get better, because it's going to depend to a large extent on the topic and your knowledge of it. And similarly, there's really no such thing as a fixed reading level, whether it's individual or grade, because those measures also do not take account of the topic and the reader's knowledge. Now, this may be fairly obvious with a body of specialized knowledge like cricket or baseball or molecular biology that has its own lingo. If you know the lingo, it's going to be easier for you to understand a text on that topic. What may be less obvious is how much we rely on our background knowledge, all kinds of background knowledge, to understand pretty much everything we read. So, for example, it has been found there's a very high correlation between knowing the answer to a question like, in what part of the body does pneumonia occur, and general reading comprehension. The more stuff you know, the more likely you are to understand what you're trying to read. And what that suggests is that if we want to boost kids' reading comprehension, rather than having them practice these skills year after year, we really should be building their academic knowledge and vocabulary as much as possible. That's the kind of knowledge and vocabulary that's assumed by a lot of written texts. So another factor in reading comprehension, beyond knowledge of the topic, general academic knowledge, is syntax, sentence structure. Because the syntax of written language is always more complex than the syntax we use in conversation. And if you're not familiar with it, it can really be a barrier to comprehension. So for example, I came across a study of a 10-year-old boy whose decoding abilities were average, but who struggled with comprehension. And the researchers read him this sentence: Rachel Carson, a scientist, writer, and ecologist, grew up in the rural river town of Springdale, Pennsylvania. And of course, Rachel Carson is the author of Silent Spring. And then the researcher asked the boy, so what do you know about Rachel Carson now? And he answered, they grew up together in the same place. Now, how did he get that answer? Well, he looked at this construction. This is called an appositive. It's a phrase describing a noun. And he thought, these were 3 different people, or maybe thought there were 4 different people, Rachel Carson and these 3 other people. And this is not an uncommon kind of mistake, according to the researchers. Kids tend to think that the noun that's closest to the verb is the subject. In written language, there can be a lot of words separating the subject and the verb. And in case you do think this is unusual, I also came across another study saying that fewer than 10% of 8th graders can evaluate complex syntax. So this can be a significant barrier to a lot of kids' comprehension of written text. So just to show you, to illustrate how these different kinds of knowledge, these 3 sort of layers of knowledge, topic knowledge, general academic knowledge and vocabulary, and knowledge of complex syntax, how they come together in real life, I'm going to show you another paragraph from a newspaper, not about cricket this time, but this is from a few years ago. And so the president referred to in this paragraph is not the current president. This time, I'd like you to think as you're reading along, think about what kinds of knowledge you're drawing on to understand it. So I'll give you a minute to read through it. So one layer of knowledge, one kind of knowledge that's assumed in this paragraph is knowledge of a particular topic, and that topic is the American legal system. Now, you don't need deep knowledge of it, but you need some familiarity with words like appeal, Supreme Court, federal appeals court, grand jury, subpoena, district attorney. And this, of course, is not written for lawyers, it's written for a general audience, and it's just assumed that you'll have some of that knowledge. But if you don't, then it's going to get harder to understand this paragraph. Beyond that, there's some general academic vocabulary, words that you don't necessarily use in conversation, like capacity, validity, obtained, served on in the sense of a subpoena. And beyond that, there's some complex syntax here, especially that second sentence, which really goes on, has a lot of clauses. And if you're unfamiliar with those things, you're really going to have a hard time understanding this paragraph. But how do you acquire that more general kind of knowledge? Well, really, the only way is through knowledge of topics, a lot of topics, because this kind of vocabulary, this kind of syntax, it doesn't stick in the abstract. It needs meaning to latch onto for it to stick in our memories. So that leads me into why knowledge, prior relevant knowledge, helps with comprehension. What is going on in the mind? Well, it has to do with the way we take in information, and the important aspect of that is working memory, which is the aspect of our consciousness where we are consciously trying to make sense of new information, where we're learning, in other words. And the important thing to know about working memory is it's very limited. It can only hold about 4 or 5 items of new information for about 20 seconds before it starts to get overwhelmed. We start to have trouble understanding. We just don't have the cognitive capacity. And that burden on working memory is called cognitive load. Now, there is a way around the limits on working memory, and that has to do with that last box, the blue box, long-term memory, which is potentially infinite. If we can just withdraw information, relevant information from long-term memory when we need it, then we don't have to juggle it in working memory, and we have more space there to take in new information. But there are a couple of tricks. One is we first have to transfer new information to long-term memory, and we also need to be able to retrieve that information when we need it. So what helps with both of those things is to explain the information to someone else in our own words. And we will come back to that idea later, but that's the basic cognitive architecture. So what does all this have to do with scores on reading tests, which is what got me interested in this whole topic in the first place? I wanted to know why there's this gap in test scores, essentially between kids at the upper and lower ends of the socioeconomic spectrum. So the passages on reading tests, like any written text, make certain assumptions about what the reader already knows. And on reading tests, the passages are not designed to be related to anything that kids have learned in school. In fact, they're designed to avoid those topics, because the theory is, well, we're not testing their content knowledge, we're just testing their general comprehension skills. But if you don't have enough background knowledge to understand the passage on the reading test, at least at a superficial level, you never get a chance to demonstrate your skill at finding the main idea, making inferences, or whatever. So to show you what that looks like, or could look like in real life, I'm going to show you another paragraph. This one is from a released item from a 3rd grade reading comprehension test, standardized reading comprehension test. Now, to us as educated adults, that paragraph might look pretty straightforward, but there are a number of words and phrases here that many 3rd graders probably won't know. And if you're missing that much information, this paragraph is starting to look like that cricket paragraph if you don't know much about cricket. Now, some third graders will know these words and phrases, or many of them, and they tend to be the third graders from more highly educated families who've been able to pick up that knowledge outside school, maybe because they've been to Alaska, or at least their parents have read them a book about the Inuit or something. But the other kids, they rely on school for this kind of information. And unfortunately, in our current system, they are the least likely to get it there. So why is that? Well, that has to do with how we allocate time during the elementary school day. So a quick quiz: how much time do you think on average elementary students spend on these subjects? Well, the federal government collected data on this from about 7,000 kids in grades 1 through 5. And here's what they found. The average amount of time spent on ELA, according to these reports, was about 2 hours. And then only about 30 minutes each on science and social studies. And I think that's probably optimistic about the amount of time spent on science and social studies in most schools, especially in schools where test scores are low. Because the idea is, well, we want to get those reading scores up, we need to spend more time on reading. And often that time consists of practicing those comprehension skills on leveled texts. But, a couple of researchers looked at this data collected by the federal government, and they asked what would happen, or what does happen, if kids get an extra half an hour a day on social studies. And they found that that was correlated with higher reading test scores, especially for children from low-income families, and not actually for children from the wealthiest families. And then they looked at what happens if kids get an extra half an hour a day on ELA or reading, and they found that that was not correlated with higher reading test scores. Now, that study can't tell us why, but certainly one possibility is that the social studies was giving kids the knowledge and vocabulary they needed to understand the passages on reading tests. So in our well-intentioned efforts to raise reading scores, we've really been undermining ourselves, shooting ourselves in the foot. Now, this approach, level texts, practicing skills and strategies on them every day, it has a negative impact on all children, because even if you're a good reader, that can get pretty boring, just reading about random topics, practicing finding the main idea. But it definitely has its worst impact on certain subgroups. Kids who struggle with decoding, who are put in the low reading groups, kids with less academic knowledge and vocabulary also put in the low reading groups and not getting an opportunity to acquire the very things that would enable them to move up. And then, of course, there are many kids who fall into both of those categories, especially at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. And the impact of this approach gets worse as time goes by, because knowledge doesn't just help you comprehend, it also helps you retain new information. It's been said that knowledge is like mental Velcro. It sticks best to other related knowledge. And some kids, the ones who are better able to acquire academic knowledge and vocabulary at home, are starting out with more of that other half of the Velcro. So when they read the more complex texts that they are allowed to read, they're in a better position to retain new vocabulary from those texts because it has something to stick to. And that in turn enables them to read yet more complex text. But the other kids who start out with less of that other half of the Velcro, they are less able to retain any new information because they don't have anything for it to stick to. And they are likely to fall farther and farther behind every year that goes by. So that's led to something that's called in cognitive science, the Matthew effect in reading, which is a reference to the Gospel of Matthew, the part that says the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And so the gaps between these two groups of students grow wider every year. And by the time kids get to high school, that gap can be very wide indeed and very difficult to narrow. So that's why it's so important to start building academic knowledge for all kids as early as possible. One problem, though, is that it can look like that skills and strategies approach is working at lower grade levels, but that's usually because the texts we're asking kids to read don't assume all that much academic knowledge. But then when they get to upper grade levels and suddenly the texts do assume that knowledge, if they don't have it, kids can hit a wall. This isn't the only kind of gap. There's a related gap that shows up most clearly at high school, which is the difference between what we assume high school students know and what many do know. And this isn't limited to kids at high poverty schools, but it's most obvious there. Many kids may not know some basic things about the world, like the difference between a city and a state, a country and a continent. They may not know much about history or even have a sense of historical chronology. They may not be able to find the United States on a map of the world. It's not their fault. It's simply because no one has taught them those things in a way that will stick. And yet they're expected to read and understand textbooks like this. And the tests at the high school level also assume a lot more knowledge and vocabulary. And if you are missing that much knowledge, this is going to be very frustrating, and it's very easy for you to become disengaged. So when I stumbled upon this problem, the lack of content in the elementary curriculum, our failure to start building knowledge early, and its enormous ramifications, I was really surprised because I thought I knew a lot about education, but I'd never heard anybody mention this as a problem. Now, there were people who were aware of this issue and very concerned about it, but I realized they were basically just talking to each other, and it wasn't getting out into the public conversation about education. And I thought, well, maybe if someone writes a more journalistic account of this with telling stories, etc., maybe that will help. So that is the book that I tried to write, The Knowledge Gap. And as concerned as I was about this issue when I was researching and writing the book, I'm even more concerned now because with remote and hybrid learning, and we are still living with that legacy, the situation has become more urgent than ever. The same kids who were not being well served by the system before the pandemic also bore the most negative impact from remote learning. And so we can't afford to go back to what we were doing before because it really wasn't working then. But I didn't write the book just to describe the problem. I also wanted to know what we can do about it. And the good news is that there is a lot that teachers and schools can do to narrow these knowledge gaps. So let's start with what individual teachers can do. First, organize read-alouds not by the skill of the week, but by a particular topic, maybe something like sea mammals, and spend at least 2 or 3 weeks reading a series of texts on that topic, because kids need to hear the same vocabulary repeatedly for that to lodge in their long-term memory. Secondly, ask questions in class discussion that put the content in the foreground rather than the skill. So rather than saying who can make an inference, ask a question about the content that implicitly requires kids to make an inference. That will work better. And getting them to use the same vocabulary they've heard, talk about the same concepts, that's a way of explaining something to someone else in your own words. And remember, that's a great way to transfer information from working memory to long-term memory, so it will be there when you need it. Third, classroom libraries, rather than just organizing them by reading level, have some books available that are organized by topic, especially if it's a topic that you've just spent time reading aloud about and talking about. Because remember the baseball study, once kids have background knowledge about a topic, they may well be able to read at a higher level than you would expect. And then spend lots of time on meaty social studies and science topics. Of course, fiction and poetry have their place in the elementary classroom, but those social studies and science topics have the most potential to build the kind of vocabulary, the kind of knowledge that really fuels reading comprehension. And then lastly, and I'll talk more about this in a few minutes, have students write about what they are learning. We know from multiple studies that when students write about what they're learning in any subject, it boosts their comprehension and their retention of the information. But there's a limit to what any individual teacher is going to be able to do to narrow the knowledge gaps, because building knowledge is a gradual cumulative process that extends across grade levels, ideally in a coherent, logical way, so that kids in 4th grade have the background knowledge from 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade to understand what they're expected to be learning. And no individual teacher has control over what happens at other grade levels. So somebody at a higher level needs to step in if we really want to make progress. So what can administrators and policymakers do? Well, a crucial step is to adopt a content-focused elementary literacy curriculum that goes deeply into topics in social studies, science, and the arts, including literature, and is organized logically and coherently. And there are now half a dozen different curricula out there that do a good job of this. They all cover different bodies of knowledge in different ways, but they all have a couple of crucial things in common. One is that they are organized by topic and not skill of the week, and they spend at least 2 or 3 weeks and sometimes much more on a topic. And secondly, they give all students in the classroom access to complex grade level or above text, and that could be through read-alouds and discussion. And so that leads me to how a knowledge-building curriculum can boost student learning by modulating cognitive load, that burden on working memory when we're trying to juggle a lot of information that's new. So it's important to realize that literacy is not just about reading. It's not even just about reading and writing. It's really about listening, speaking, reading, and writing. There's an important difference between listening and speaking on the one hand and reading and writing, which is listening and speaking are easier, right? We don't need to teach kids to do those things. We have evolved as human beings to naturally do those things. And that means that in themselves, listening and speaking don't impose a burden on working memory. They don't impose a cognitive load. And that means that we have more capacity in working memory to take in new information and make sense of it. So reading text aloud is going to be the most efficient way to build kids' academic knowledge and vocabulary in the first instance, and their familiarity with complex syntax. And then having them talk about the content they've just listened to is going to be a great way of getting it into long-term memory. Once they have that background knowledge that can enable them to do these more cognitively demanding tasks of reading and writing at a higher level, because they won't be having to juggle new information in working memory. They'll have some familiarity with the content, and they'll have more capacity for things like decoding and spelling and all of those things that reading and writing involve. But this only works if they're reading and writing about the same topic that they've been listening to and talking about. And that's unfortunately not what we do in the standard approach. Kids might be listening to a text about sea mammals. The discussion, though, might focus on not on the content, but on author's purpose or something like that. And then they go off to read about some other topic and maybe write about yet another topic. So we're making reading and writing harder than they need to be. So to sum up, an effective curriculum is, first of all, going to focus on content, spend sufficient time on it, give all students access to the same complex text, and then have them engage in listening, speaking, reading, and writing about the same content. Another way of looking at this is that literacy is going to develop in the early grades, certainly, along 2 different paths that will ultimately come together. So one path is going to be developing those foundational skills, maybe reading decodable texts. That's not going to be the way kids are acquiring academic knowledge. The way they're going to be doing that is through those read-alouds and discussion. And then when their decoding word recognition skills catch up to where their background knowledge is, they'll be able to read and write at a higher level. If you're interested in more information about this and more information about the knowledge building curricula in general, I really urge you to go to the website of the Knowledge Matters campaign, which has a wealth of information about that topic. But let's now take another look at those reading infographics, science of reading infographics, and see if the way they're formulated could, in the current context, lead to some misconceptions about how to go about teaching kids to understand what they read. It's not that there's anything inherently wrong with these infographics, it's just that they are possibly open to misinterpretation. So here we have language comprehension defined as the ability to understand spoken language. Well, it's really not just understanding spoken language, because written language is more complex than spoken language in the sense of conversation. So really what this means is the ability to understand written language when it's read aloud. And then let's look at the 5 pillars of early literacy, which is, of course, drawn from the National Reading Panel report that was released in 2000. There are a number of, I think, possible misinterpretations here. One is somebody, I saw someone on Twitter say, how come comprehension is a pillar? Shouldn't it be like the roof or something? Because isn't that what this was all leading to? I think that's a great point. Another point here is that making it one of these pillars could give the impression that we should just teach comprehension as a skill, just have kids practice their skills. And this infographic, like the National Reading Panel report itself, really omits the crucial roles of background knowledge and familiarity with complex syntax and comprehension. So it's easy to interpret this as meaning all you need to do is teach skills and strategies, or at least the strategies that were recommended by the National Reading Panel. Now, the Scarborough's rope, the reading rope, is definitely more fleshed out. But even here, there are possible misinterpretations. So this infographic does mention background knowledge, but teachers are aware that background knowledge is a factor in comprehension, and one of the strategies is activating background knowledge. But if kids don't have any relevant background knowledge to activate, that won't work. Teachers may realize that they may look at a text that kids are about to read and think, well, there are 5 or 6 words here they won't know, and so they'll define those words. And that can help the kids get through that text. But remember that without repetition of those words, without encountering them repeatedly in different contexts, those words probably are not going to stick in long-term memory, so they won't be available to kids when they try to read other texts. And then there's vocabulary, which is crucial, but having these as 2 separate strands could make it look like you can just teach them separately, and really that's impossible. The only way to enable kids to acquire as much vocabulary as they need to become proficient readers is to expand their knowledge. And then lastly, we do have a mention of syntax, not necessarily that it's more complex in written language, but still it's mentioned. Another thing that's not mentioned, though, is that really the best way to teach syntax is through writing instruction. And I will talk more about that in just a few minutes. But first, I'd like to tell you about a couple of elementary school classrooms I followed through a school year when I was researching the book, The Knowledge Gap. And these were 2 early elementary classrooms. The idea was to compare one that was using the standard skills-focused approach to comprehension with another that was using one of the more recently developed knowledge-building curricula. And this was back in 2016. The only one that was out there at the time was CKLA. So that's what was being used. Now, these 2 classrooms were not identical. Of course, no 2 classrooms are. One was 1st grade, one was 2nd grade, but they were similar in many ways. All of the kids in both classrooms came from low-income families. They were all children of color, and the teachers in both classrooms were hardworking, dedicated, good teachers. But what was going on in these 2 classrooms was like they were on 2 different planets. And the main reason for that was the curriculum, was what was being taught. And I wish I could show you videos of those classrooms. I don't have those, but I do have pictures I took of anchor charts, posters that were on the wall. And this is a typical one from the skills-focused classroom. They were all about main idea, sequence of events, skills. It was very hard for the teacher to engage these kids in discussion because they were 6 years old and they just really didn't have much to say about sequence of events and the abstract. The other classroom was full of anchor charts that looked like this, full of content. This is one from the unit on Greek myths. It's about the myth of Daedalus and Icarus. The kids loved Greek myths and many other topics. The War of 1812. They often did not want the read aloud to end. They still had their hands up when it was time for discussion to end. They were highly engaged and really proud of all the stuff they were learning. But I'd like to point out just a couple of things about this poster. And by the way, it's not mandatory to do charts like this with CKLA. This was just something this particular school was doing, but it does give us insight into what was going on in the classroom. And so one thing I'd like to point out are the vocabulary words of the day: desperately, plummeted, and foresight. And these were all words that were appearing in the read aloud text. These are pretty sophisticated words for any group of 2nd graders, most of the kids in this classroom came from non-English speaking families, and some were still learning English themselves. And yet they were using these words, they understood these words, they sometimes were using them in their own conversation, not just in class discussion. And they were going to remember these words. Those words are going to help them in years to come because they were encountering them repeatedly in an engaging context. So this word plummeted at the top appears down here. Icarus's wings melted and he plummeted into the sea. Very vivid image. Now, the other thing I'd like to point out is that it could look like this teacher is teaching skills. There's this question, predict, what is Daedalus's plan, and these boxes, cause and effect, but she's not trying to teach the skill and bringing in books or text to teach the skill. She's bringing these skills in to get kids to think about the content. And she's not saying, okay, can you make a prediction? She's asking, what is Daedalus's plan? And that's what's going to work, putting the content in the foreground, bringing in questions like this to help kids think analytically. So writing, I do want to talk for a few minutes about writing because it's really important, not just as a skill in itself, but also as a powerful lever for building the kind of knowledge that fuels reading comprehension and learning. And so why is it so powerful? Well, it has to do with transferring information to long-term memory and then practicing retrieving it. The more you practice retrieving an item, the more likely you are to be able to get it when you need it. And remember, for both of these things, what works really well is explaining the information to someone else in your own words, and that is what we do when we write. So it helps with both transfer and retrieval, and that is what gives it its power. In fact, it's so potentially powerful that it can compensate for missing the other half of the Velcro, even in high school, where kids may be missing a lot of that Velcro. But it's also the hardest thing we ask students to do. And again, that has to do with working memory and the burden, that cognitive load that writing places on working memory. If you're an inexperienced writer, you may be juggling everything from forming letters to spelling words, choosing words, organizing your thoughts, understanding the content, and that peculiar syntax and vocabulary of written language that you may not be familiar with. And all of that creates not just cognitive load, but stress, which is also a burden on working memory. So it's very easy for students to get overwhelmed when we ask them to write, especially if we ask them to write at length. So writing instruction has enormous potential power, but we have not unlocked that power because, first of all, we've underestimated how hard it is. We've just kind of expected kids to pick it up. And secondly, we've tried to teach it in isolation from content, so we're not using it to build the knowledge we want kids to acquire. They may be writing about personal experience or opinions or about topics in a separate writing curriculum. So to unlock the power of writing, we need to do three things. First, modulate that heavy cognitive load, and that could mean starting instruction at the sentence level, if that's what kids need. Secondly, teach grammar and conventions in the context of students' own writing, which is for many kids the only thing that will work. And starting at the sentence level will make that easier as well, because you're not confronted with 5 pages of error-filled prose. And then lastly, embed writing activities in the content of the core curriculum. And I know of only one method that combines all three of those things. So I'm the co-author of this book, The Writing Revolution, but the method was created by my co-author, Judith Hochman, who is a veteran educator. And I don't have time to explain the method in detail, but I'd like to at least give you an idea of what it consists of. So one of the sentence level activities that's part of the method is called Because, But, and So. And this consists of giving students a sentence stem that they need to complete with each of these conjunctions. This method, it's not a curriculum of its own, but it is designed to be adapted to whatever curriculum you're using in any subject matter and at any grade level. So this example is going to be embedded in content from a 2nd grade unit in CKLA about ancient Indian civilization. And here's the stem you could give students. A civilization could form in the Indus River Valley because, but, and so. Each of these conjunctions requires students to retrieve a different kind of information from long-term memory and put it in their own words. And there are different possible responses, but because the fertile soil allowed people to stay in one place and grow crops. That's one, and this is a great vocabulary review and reinforcer. But first, people had to figure out how to control floods from the river. So archaeologists have been able to uncover the remains of a city called Mohenjo-Daro. And as I mentioned, this can be used across the curriculum, including in math class. So let's say you're teaching about decimals and fractions. You could use the same activity with fractions and decimals because they are all parts of wholes, but they are written differently, so they can be used interchangeably. And remember that barrier to comprehension, complex syntax. So what can we do to clear up confusion like this? Well, we can teach students what an appositive is, phrase describing a noun, using familiar content to modulate the cognitive load. And then after students have learned something about Rachel Carson, give them this sentence to complete so that they have to supply the appositive. And that is not only teaching them about this kind of syntax, which will help with their reading comprehension, but also reinforcing that knowledge, cementing it in long-term memory. And these activities can be adapted for young children who are maybe having difficulty spelling or writing. If they're learning about frogs, you could give them pre-printed strips of words embedded in that content that are mismatched. And these are using subordinating conjunctions: before, when, after. Before frog embryos hatch, that first line reads, the yellow part says they eat insects and worms. Well, if kids have been paying attention, they know that's not true. So they need to rearrange them. And this also supplies appropriate punctuation. And these activities can be done with young children or really any age group orally. And that's a good idea when you're first introducing a new writing concept. So let's say kids are learning about sound waves, and this is taken from the CKLA kindergarten curriculum. You could use that because but exercise. You can't see sound waves because they are invisible. Kids could supply that answer orally. Teacher could write it on the board. But you can hear them, and they're reinforcing their knowledge of sound waves while learning about conjunctions and how to use them. So the method does go beyond sentences, but sentence level work is what lays the foundation for independent writing at length. Outlining is also crucial to modulate the heavy cognitive load that writing at length imposes. And creating an outline in itself is a knowledge building activity. So just to briefly show you how all of this can come together, this is an example of a single paragraph outline, and the method teaches kids how to complete an outline for a paragraph before writing one. So they'll be drawing on their sentence level skills to do this. This is a topic sentence that uses an appositive. This is obviously embedded in content about Martin Luther King. A civil rights leader is the appositive, and students will have been taught using an appositive. That's one good way of constructing a topic sentence. They also will have been taught how to brainstorm details that relate to that topic sentence and to put them into note form using symbols and abbreviations. And they will have been taught how to come up with a concluding sentence. This one uses a subordinating conjunction, although Martin Luther King never saw segregation end, and they will have learned using a subordinating conjunction. That's a good way, one good way of constructing a concluding sentence. Now, students could stop here and they will have deepened and cemented their knowledge about Martin Luther King, even if they never turn this into a finished piece of writing. But if they want to, it's a pretty simple task at this point to construct a paragraph. They just transfer their topic and concluding sentences, and then they turn those notes into their detail sentences, again, drawing on their sentence level skills, including using transition words and phrases to connect their thoughts. And they will have learned how to do that in an activity that may be embedded in different content. For example, something like this, which is embedded in content about the American Revolution. They get one sentence and then a word beginning the second sentence that is a transition word, and they have to supply the rest of that second sentence. So I would argue that really writing, this kind of explicit writing instruction is the better way to get at all those things we try to accomplish through teaching comprehension strategies. Because when we're writing, we are doing those things. We're finding the main idea and supporting details, making inferences, comparing and contrasting. And we're doing it in a more powerful way. Why? Well, the content has got to be in the foreground, which is what works. You can't write about nothing. You can also tell if students are getting it. If they're off reading a book and they're practicing finding the main idea, are they really, but you can tell pretty quickly if you take a look at their writing. And lastly, you are reaching every student in the classroom and not just those who participate in class discussion. So effective writing instruction can turbocharge any content-rich curriculum, but if it's focused on comprehension skills, it's probably not going to work, because if you're jumping from topic to topic, focusing on skills, kids are probably not going to accumulate enough information about any one topic to enable them to write coherently about it. So content-rich curriculum is the place to start. And if the curriculum doesn't build all of these things simultaneously, we risk many students not becoming fully literate, and the pendulum may swing away from phonics once again, because students may get to upper grade levels and they may be able to decode, if they've gotten good foundational skills instruction, they may be able to decode more complex text, but they won't be able to understand it. This has happened before, and what has happened before is people who are maybe skeptical of phonics say, well, you see, they can't understand what they're trying to read, so phonics doesn't work. Well, it doesn't mean phonics doesn't work, it just means phonics is not enough. So do we need a new term? Science of reading is kind of limiting, maybe science of literacy, or even science of learning, because once you get past foundational skills, what we read, what we understand, and what we can write really draws on everything we've been able to learn. Well, I'll just put that out there. I don't expect that to happen. But remember, science of reading is not just talking about phonics. And curriculum, as I said, is the place to start. But I don't want to leave you with the idea that all you need to do is adopt a content-rich curriculum and you're good to go, because this is going to be quite different from what most teachers are used to, and there may be obstacles to getting it implemented well. And one potential obstacle is standardized tests, because they're not related to the knowledge contained in any of these curricula. And so students may have acquired a lot of valuable knowledge and vocabulary, but they get to the test and the passages are on completely different topics, and they just don't have the vocabulary to understand those passages. Eventually, if they continue with the knowledge building curriculum, they will, but it can take years to see results on standardized tests. Other possible obstacles may be intellectual obstacles, because this is just very different from what most teachers have heard about how comprehension works, and they may be skeptical. Emotional obstacles, because if you've been teaching in a certain way for years, it's very hard to hear that maybe what you've been doing hasn't been working. And so all of us as human beings raise defenses against taking in that kind of message. And then there are obstacles of habit, behavioral obstacles, because even if you want to do things differently, teaching is such a complex activity that it's very easy to fall back into long-standing habits. None of these obstacles are insurmountable. Teachers are overcoming them as we speak, but they will need support, most teachers. And that will mean, first of all, understanding the why. Why does change need to happen? Because change is hard, and if you don't understand why it's necessary, maybe you won't do it. Secondly, the what, the instructional materials, the curriculum that enable teachers to make this change. And then beyond that, the how to implement those well, how to adapt them to the needs of your particular students. And that could look like coaching from someone who really understands the curriculum. Now, change is beginning to happen, and even the media are beginning to notice. So this is an article from the Louisville Courier-Journal about a district that realized they needed to do more than change their approach to phonics. And teachers, like many teachers who've made this kind of switch, they were skeptical. They thought their students wouldn't be able to handle this kind of a curriculum, but they found that they like being challenged. And that's what I hear from teachers over and over again. And I'd just like to end with an anecdote that I think illustrates the power of knowledge building curriculum, not just to raise student achievement, that's important, but also to change expectations. So this is a story about a second grade teacher who was giving her one of her students a test to determine his individual reading level. And this was a little boy who struggled like crazy with reading. And the school had recently adopted a knowledge building curriculum, CKLA, because this was years ago. And the teacher saw in the testing kit, there was a text on the topic of westward expansion, which was the topic the class had just spent 2 or 3 weeks learning about. But that text was at a 4th grade level, and this was a struggling 2nd grade reader. Just out of curiosity, the teacher handed the text to the boy, and to her surprise, he read it with 98% accuracy and 100% comprehension. And I think that changed the teacher's idea of who that little boy was and what he was capable of doing, and probably changed that little boy's idea of what he could do as well. And this is one reason I feel so much urgency about the topic, because we are making untold numbers of children, with the best of intentions, we're making them feel like failures, when in fact, it's the system that's failed them. So I won't read through these points, but just to sum up, and if you have questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. If we have time, you can always contact me through my website. I do have a free newsletter, Substack newsletter called Minding the Gap. And thank you very much. And I'll stop sharing and take questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Natalie. I think I learned a lot from what you shared. I imagine our guests have too. I don't see any questions in the chat right now, or in the Q&A document. But if there is one, please feel free to post it now and we'll pose the question to Natalie.
It's great to hear.
Love that. This was so powerful. I can't wait to share with others. Thank you, Jody.
And if you do think of questions later, as I mentioned, I'm happy to try to answer them. You can contact me through my website, nataliewexler.com.
Thank you all again for joining us. We will stay on if you want to ask some questions, but for those of you that we'll see you again someday soon, I hope.
Right. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.